Good morning, good day, everyone. Welcome to session 10795, multi-stakeholder collaboration in agricultural water management solutions to advance the sustainability goals set by the UN. Just a minute and a reminder that in order to hear the dialogue, you need to put on your earphones. There's a little strange setup here. So welcome. And yes, so pleased and honored to have this time and so grateful to our panelists for helping to think about how can we advance our sustainability goals together? How do we take action following the great dialogue that's coming out of UN World Water Week, the Daughtery Water for Food Institute's Global Symposium, and now here at World Water Week in Stockholm. I'm Kathy Boomer. I'm a scientific program director for our sustainable water management area at the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. We are a nonprofit based in DC that gives research grants to address challenges in food supply and agricultural sustainability. We are funded through the Farm Bill, which means every dollar that we invest has to be matched by non-federal dollars. So I get to basically double the investment in water research. And I can tell you, it's a tough job. It is not easy. So not only do I know our sustainability goals depend on these partnerships, my job depends on these partnerships, and it's tough work. So how do we facilitate this dialogue? How do we actually think together about taking action? I forgot, I also wanted to acknowledge, in addition to our fantastic panelists, we've had tremendous support and dialogue with a range of partners. And I can't tell you how much these dialogues make the work lighter and easier. That this is an easy dialogue to have here at a forum about water, but much harder when you're out talking to folks who work more on climate resiliency and food resiliency. Okay. So let's dive right into it. We are all aware of our environmental water challenges. I don't have to walk us through on the challenges that are hitting us every day. What I do want to put forward and have us focus on is the global agricultural water sustainability has the capacity to address many of our collective goals. If we define our overarching goal as protecting and restoring natural waters to enhance agricultural production, domestic water supply, and biodiversity. And again, that goal hits on more than half of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So what are the themes coming out of these global forums that can help guide this next conversations? They include thinking about advancing global theory for local implementation, developing a systems-based framework for sustainability, and promoting an all-hands-on-deck mentality for learning while doing, right? There's a lot of uncertainty with regard to how do we achieve our goals. When we think about these themes, you're taken to thinking about adaptive management. We've heard a lot of adaptive management mentioned. There are many definitions of adaptive management, so it's worth taking a minute out to share how we're thinking about this framework for managing in the face of uncertainty. So it's a very explicit logic framework for laying out the goals and the objectives, working with stakeholders to define those objectives. And then based on that unified understanding, thinking about what are alternatives to advance those objectives and ultimately advance our goals. And once we've laid out those alternatives, to use science to think about where that implementation, where those practices can provide the targeted benefits, and when those practices can provide those targeted benefits. And then hopefully we're collecting data to evaluate, did the system behave as we expected it to? Did it respond to our management practices? And if not, how can we reset, retool to make better decisions in the future? Now, there's many of you will appreciate that there's a bit of a nested structure. You could think about applying this adaptive management framework at multiple levels or scales, right? So we could focus on technical uncertainty, that what do we know about the science, and do we need more knowledge regarding what practices to put on the ground? But there's a broader realm, if you will, of uncertainty, knowledge that goes into managing these systems. And that is understanding the stakeholder concerns, their constraints, their barriers, their priorities when thinking about advancing these goals. That's where we can promote institutional learning, right? And part of that institutional learning also means thinking about the governance of the programs that we're using to advance our initiatives. So it's interesting that we don't have a lot of water management programs that are yet going through that iterative process, right? With that kind of reflection and reset, but we can look across multiple water management programs to learn and to think about opportunities to learn from that institutional scale. And so that's what this session is all about. What I'm going to do is lay out, I'm going to call it a straw man of goals, objectives, and implementation strategies, and then invite our panelists to share their perspectives from working around the world and working with producers and landowners on the ground. So here we go with that straw man. Already shared our goals of protecting and restoring natural waters to enhance agricultural production, domestic water supply, and biodiversity. And I added for 7 generations, right? Not just for today, but for our children's children and beyond. And I want to acknowledge that water management, the focus on water management is essential because many of the ecosystem services that we value are critically or inextricably tied to water availability, to soil water content. These include maximizing surface water and aquifer recharge. This includes limiting soil carbon loss and enhancing carbon sequestration, reducing nutrient loss through leaching and greenhouse gas emissions, protecting water quality, restoring habitat suitability for targeted terrestrial and aquatic species, limiting on-site, and downstream vulnerability to flooding and microdroughts. And then, of course, ensuring that we can provide adequate food supplies for the growing world population. Okay, so if we can agree on those goals and objectives, how do we achieve those? And what we're proposing is a focus on terrestrial water storage, right? Really thinking about managing that near surface ground and water supply through the combination of precision irrigation and also conservation drainage. So what do we mean by precision irrigation? That is really, broadly speaking, the idea of using information to inform our use of water, not only for maximizing or optimizing plant growth, but also protecting soil health, watershed health, and minimizing greenhouse gas emissions. Conservation drainage is a set of practices that I don't think I've heard yet here mentioned at World Water Week. And this is what keeps me up at night. This is what really drives my work. We forget that artificial drainage is a key factor, a key element of the Anthropocene, right? We have lengthened our river systems by tens of thousands of kilometers or miles through artificial drainage. And yet we put little focus on thinking about how that enhanced connectivity is depleting our soil moistures, is changing the flow regimes of our river systems, and delivering nutrients and sediment to our coastal shallow waters. Conservation drainage includes a set of practices, not only in-field controlled drainage, but edge of field riparian grass buffers, two-stage ditches, also edge of stream riparian buffers, floodplain restorations and wetland restorations. So for many of you, you should be thinking nature-based solutions, right? This is our opportunity to work with agriculture in putting these solutions on the ground. And our challenge is we have very low adoption rates of these water practices. This is just a slide emphasizing there's a lot of focus on practices, field practices that we associate with soil health and climate resiliency, but very little adoption and very little focus on those water management practices. Yet I think everyone here would agree water management is absolutely fundamental to achieving our climate resiliency and regenerative agriculture goals. Why the low adoption rates? One hypothesis that I would put forward, and I'm excited to hear our panelists respond to, is that we don't fully understand the decision context. Who's the decision maker? I think of the decision maker mostly as the producer, the landowners who are asking to put these practices on the ground. But I also recognize they get their information. A lot of their decisions is driven by the technical support, their collaborations with industry. They're also driven by market demand, right? And agriculture, the corporate agriculture, is not just fulfilling consumer demand, but also has their commitments to sustainability. And then outside of that is also government policy influence, policies that may provide a disincentive or incentive to adopt these practices. And the relative importance of these influencers probably differs depending on where you are and what the climate conditions are. The other reason for a low adoption rate, I would contend, is the lack of a unified systems framework. What's that systems model that each of us, including producers, landowners on the ground, how do we think the system behaves and will respond to our management practices? Here are three ideas just to kind of set the altitude and help facilitate the conversation. There's definitely a portion of us who tend to think at the crop scale and the interaction of crops and soil as the key driver affecting soil water fluxes. When we think about downstream impacts, we tend to think about the catchment scale using watershed models. And then there's a third idea or kind of example that I wanted to share that I hear more from stakeholders, not as much in the academic world, thinking about river systems as a cue to informing us how our lands are responding to climate and human interventions, right? So the expansion and the contraction of that river system and how that affects the distribution of soil water content throughout that watershed will have a big effect on the ecosystem services that we all care about, and also could provide a cue to thinking about where we can put precision irrigation and precision conservation drainage practices on the ground. Okay, so with that background, excited to introduce our panelists. We'll have Shama Praveen from Ceres first give us a little bit more background about kind of the climate for public-private partnerships. And then really excited to have Tom Eisman, Nora Van Kaverberg, and Nick Brazovic join the panel and give their thoughts, their insights from their work around the world about continuing this dialogue. And what I hope, I don't think we can come up with any answers in this short 90-minute session, which I've already gone over time, but I hope it stirs dialogue and keeps us talking once we leave the room after this session. So with that, I will pass the ball to Shama Praveen is the Director of Water Research at Ceres, and I'm really excited. They've done a lot of work looking into the opportunities for public-private partnerships.
Hello. It's a little bit strange. I cannot hear myself, but then I believe everybody else can. I'm Shama. I lead the water research division at Ceres. I'll be giving a little bit different perspective as to how we influence companies and investors on working on ag water stewardship. Launched last year. It's a global investor-led initiative that basically works with investors and companies to act and value on water. Since the inception and the launch last year, we have about 92 investors with $17 trillion in assets under management who are forming engagement teams with companies, and they're moving the ball on how companies can act and value on water more. So for those of you who are not aware of the water program of Ceres, we basically work with institutional investors, Fortune 500 companies, and nonprofit organizations to work on water resources. And behind everything we do, we build up a solid, robust research that we try to do to be able to engage the investors, to educate the investors on the financial materiality of water risks, and to be able to engage companies more. So for that, we collaborate with various institutions, various organizations, so they're better able to understand the financial materiality of water risks. So this is day 3 of the conference. I know you have seen these statistics float all around you, but I would say that let's pause for a moment, and because we are all here convening from different locations globally, every time I see somebody there from a different region, if the stats say 2.3 billion people don't have access to safely managed water, it's basically 1 in 4. So for a few, it's one of you could be facing that risk. So if you think like that, the impacts are quite sobering. So with that in mind, we launched the Valuing Water Finance initiative with the vision basically for the companies to recognize fresh water as the world's most precious natural resource, essential to whole industries and all communities and ecosystems. So basically, we are calling on companies to work towards the ambition of 2030, to evaluate water from all its various points, not just water quantity, water quality. So if I move to the next slide, you'll see the North Star of the initiative is actually the 6 corporate expectations for valuing water. And this is the water stewardship ambition that we are sharing with the investors. Investors are signing on to it. So they're engaging their portfolio companies to act on these expectations. So basically by 2030, we are saying that for water quantity, companies will not negatively impact water availability in water scarce areas across their entire value chain, and so on and so forth for quality, ecosystem protection, WASH, board oversight, public policy engagement. So basically the entire gamut of ESG issues. So as I said, we behind every initiative that we launch, behind every activity, we build it up with lots of robust research. This is one research that we did last year with the University of Saskatchewan, Global Institute of Water Security, where we basically, we knew what kind of impacts industries have on fresh water, but we have evidence in bits and pieces in literature, scientific literature, media, press releases. So this basically put all of the evidence together, going back to 1950, to figure out which industries are having systemic impacts on fresh water, basically to map the entire value chain of these different systemic impacting sectors to see where in the value chain the impact is highest. So basically it gives a roadmap to the industries from various sectors. If they really want to see the materiality of impacts, they can basically take evidence from this report. So how are food and beverage companies responding to water risks? We've been working with some of the largest food and beverage companies for last few years now, starting 2015. The benchmark that we have been doing is called Feeding Ourselves Thirsty. And so trending from 2015 to 2021 onwards, we saw some improvements, like lots of companies were, because of the engagements we were doing, lots of companies were moving forward with their boards having explicit oversight over water-related issues. More and more executive compensation were being linked to water-related goals and targets. We saw more evidence for watershed protection plans and financial incentives to farmers. However, there were few places where the progress was quite limited, in the sense that there was lack of robust risk assessments, mostly focusing in the ag supply chains. There was lack of supplier expectations on water use and water quality. There was a lack of targets on water quantity and quality. All of this focusing in high stress regions, focusing in high stress watersheds and in the ag supply chains. And when incentives were being given to farmers, it was mostly lacking in the high stress regions. So by now we know that there's so many high stress watersheds, almost half of US, southwest, western part of US. Like, I'm from California, we are facing a tropical hurricane, like first one in 80 years. That's like unheard of. And most of the Western states relying on the water from Colorado, they are facing stress similar in magnitude to the Middle Eastern countries, which is pretty bizarre if you think about it. So in conversations with the companies, we saw that there were few hurdles that these companies said that they were facing. Not that they were not eager to work on it, but then there were some actual hurdles that we needed to think about in conversations with the companies. Some of these were, there was not a lot of traceability work going on. Like, there was no system for traceability where from the farm to the warehouses, like where the sourcing is happening, which stress regions, which farmers are sourcing what. Also, lots of primary and tertiary suppliers were in constant flux. So there was no accountability, right? And then there were grower reluctance to engage in ag water stewardship, especially if those growers were renting or leasing the land. They had no incentive to adopt those water saving practices. There was limited understanding of water saving practices within the growers and the technologies, the tools and strategies. And of course, the last one was, companies like to have alternate sourcing options, but then with so much of climate water variability going on, it limits their sourcing places and their strategies. But then some of the leading companies have also been talking about moving beyond the volumetric improvements to looking at stuff that, oriented outcomes towards the watershed, looking at basin health holistically, and partnering for collective action. Speaking of collective action, this month we also launched a report, which is a company-level cost-benefit analysis framework, which basically gives the entire mapping of where within the value chain companies can really put in the cost of solutions and where the benefits, ROI, and the societal return on investment could be high. And the scenarios tell us that collective action works. Finally, this is my final slide. Finally, we have used all of these learnings from our previous initiatives benchmark, and we have created this new benchmark where we will be assessing where companies are. We have 72 companies on the focus list from food, beverage, apparel, and high-tech sectors. Looking at those, we are trying to see where in the journey of the 2030 ambition do the companies lie. In meeting the 2030 sustainability ambitions, where is the gap? Is it in water quantity? Is it in water quality? Like those kind of things. And then it will also highlight the key strengths and gaps across the companies and across the sectors. This report will be launched in October, so be on the lookout for it. And I'm going to end there. So I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Shaika?
We're going to keep rolling with this panel, and I'm very excited for our next speaker, Tom Eisman, who is the Director of Water Scarcity and Markets for the Global Freshwater Program at the Nature Conservancy. Nature Conservancy is very dear to me. Was there for 10 years, and I think of them as world leaders in science-based resource management and stakeholder engagement. So thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Kathy. Thank you for having me. I wanted to thank FAR and also the Water for Food Institute for bringing this session to World Water Week. I think we're all here for a reason. Probably all of us agree with the importance of looking at the integration of agricultural and food production with water management. So thanks for that. That said, I was told I was in the role of provocateur, so I'm going to try to elaborate on a few of the issues that have been raised and point out some of the challenges that we see in our work at the Nature Conservancy, as well as that I think will face all of us as we approach these issues in agricultural water management. Just to say a little bit about my role, I'm in the Global Food and Water Program of the Nature Conservancy. We call it a food and water program, but we actually, a lot of us either work on food or water. And one of the challenges is how we can work better together. And so I'll say a little bit more about that as we go along, but we're doing work on these issues in close to 80 countries around the world. And our focus is on protecting ecosystems, lands and waters on which all life depends. So Kathy showed a slide and Shama also referred to this issue. One of the things that's really important in the Nature Conservancy as we work, and we often approach, particularly in our work on water issues, we approach these issues from a catchment or basin scale. And I think there are going to be real challenges in how we address these issues, and particularly around the issues of scale as we think about scale. But the first problem that we often confront is looking, we'll start often with global models or assessments, looking at food production and water risk and agricultural practices. And then the question is, how do you use these models, or how useful are these models as we look to downscale to a catchment? And oftentimes we find they're useful in flagging some issues and starting to point the direction, but there are real challenges. And often even internally, we find our own teams correcting us or scolding us about the ways that we've characterized global models or tried to apply them. So that's kind of a starting point risk. But I think even the bigger challenge here, and particularly as we work on agricultural water management, is scaling from the catchment to the farms. And oftentimes we're talking about implementing practices with farmers and on farms, so at more of a local scale. And as we look at things like irrigation practices or cropping patterns, crop selection, use of fertilizers or nutrients, we're looking at the applications on a farm, and that's often the level of action where you can actually change a practice. But the question becomes then, are we delivering outcomes at a scale that matters to the ecosystem or the basin? If we're conserving water in one place, is it returning to the river or the ecosystem and flowing downstream, or is it being captured by another user? If we're trying to address water quality issues on one farm, is that actually enough to make a difference in the cumulative loads in a basin? So I think that's a question or a challenge that we have to face, is how do we look at the work that we're doing on a farm, and how does it add up to having a meaningful impact at a basin scale? And also as part of that, I think one of the questions will be, how do we select our interventions and locate them geospatially within a catchment so they have the most optimal impact at that basin scale? And I think we see a lot of examples of that, a couple of which have been referred to already. But one for me, coming at it from the water management perspective, I've done a lot of work in the American West. A place like the Colorado River Basin is 7 states and 2 countries. They're clearly facing a water crisis. And a lot of it focuses on the dams and storage and reservoirs. But the question is, 75 to 80% of the water use is going for agriculture. And so how can we make a meaningful impact on this water scarcity problem through our work with individual farmers in the basin? So kind of flipping between that 7-state basin scale and then the individual farmers who are using the water. Let's see, the second challenge I was going to point out, and it relates to the question about scale, but that's integration. And how do you integrate across a catchment? And as I said, part of that is scale, looking at the different units of spatial scale. But I think, fundamentally, there's a challenge, and I mentioned this at the beginning. A lot of us come at this from the perspective of agriculture. Maybe a lot of us in this room come at this from the perspective of water and water management and water resources. And they definitely operate at a different scale. They have different communities, often different cultures, different ministries or government or policies, different funding and finance, different outcomes that you might try to achieve. And I mentioned that we face this problem in the Nature Conservancy. I think a lot of us would say we're water people. Others might say we're ag people. But how do we get these two communities to work more together? And how do we integrate across those important elements of management, policy, and governance? So I think that's another challenge that I wanted to raise that we certainly experience, and I think others will as well. But again, thank you for the opportunity to address this topic. I'm really glad it's on the agenda here at Water Week.
Thank you, Tom. Oh, and you really, yes. Tom, your call to attention or focus on the modeling frameworks that we use to guide our work and the uncertainty sets us up well for our next speaker, Nora van Kouwenberg from the UN IHE Delft Institute. I was thrilled to have Nora join the panel. We've had some great discussions about uncertainty and risk tied to perceptions and values, and how do we manage that together? And so it's the perfect segue to introduce Nora.
Yes, thank you, Kathy, for inviting me to the panel. And indeed, so I would like to zoom in on one of the things that Kathy mentioned about the adoption rate, and also connecting it back to what Shama and Tom mentioned. And it's the idea of why, if we're looking at the challenges and the path that is set out by the SDGs, we can easily see that there's a lot of innovation needed, right? And in innovation, the problem of adoption is very much linked to the fact that there is risk perceived in changing, and that risk is linked to the uncertainty, and it starts acting as a barrier. And we have been doing quite some research on that to understand, okay, so if that is a given, then how do we overcome that? And the answer is, interestingly, that it is not by reducing the uncertainty, but by managing the uncertainty. And I will discuss that a bit more. So we see often and I've been doing a lot of work on introduction of nature-based solutions for flood and drought risks, and doing that in different kind of catchment with different kind of problems. And we noticed that actually the resistance that was coming for the adoption of what we understand, this is a technological innovation. It's a nature-based technology, but still it's a sort of technology. We're linked to four things. And one of them is just the knowledge, understanding what it is that we're trying to do and what could potentially be the impact. Indeed, also there's regulatory barriers. So sometimes this will be impossible to implement this kind of what Kathy is referring to as conservation drainage because of the policy or regulatory context. There's also definitely problems with the financing investment around it. And very nice to see what Sirius is doing there, with what Shama was presenting. But also one important thing was that it's about, we're unclear on how we're going to evaluate what is now a good or a bad performance. And that is about explaining what models, so as what Tom was discussing, can do and what they cannot do. And so about making the uncertainty that is in there transparent, but it's also about acknowledging that uncertainty goes beyond the epistemic uncertainty of how the water cycle works, or the variability that we cannot really predict, or we don't know how to translate from global to local, but also the uncertainty that is related to the different knowledge frames that stakeholders have. Yeah? And that type of uncertainty is what we're calling ambiguity, and that's a very important uncertainty that has to be managed. And so, as a provoking statement, what I would like to say here is that we have to stop investing so much time and effort in reducing or managing this epistemic and uncertainty and variability, and really acknowledge that there's so much knowledge frame uncertainty that we have to focus on. And what does that mean? It means that we have to talk to the stakeholders and create, sharing of those different knowledge frames, sharing of how people see things different, and create alliances of trust that will kind of guarantee that we can move forward and adopt innovations. Because there will be a joint understanding that, okay, we are making decisions, and that's risky because there is uncertainty, but it's also risky to not take a decision. Yeah. So the risk is there, and we're all used to taking decisions under risk. But the idea is that if we do that with different knowledge frames, we need to have this trust that when something happens that we did not foresee, we have a system in place of managing those differences and managing the uncertainty. And with that, I want to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. And one takeaway, you brought in the temporal element or scale, right? Because you talked about a storm-based system response, and yet for many of our agroecosystem services, we tend to think about annual average responses, and that's another dimension to the models and the guidance, and maybe a challenge to these conversations. So our last provocateur for our session is Dr. Nick Brozovic, who is an economist and director of policy for the University of Nebraska's Daughtry Water for Food Institute. Very pleased to pass the ball.
Well, welcome everybody in the room and online. It's a pleasure to be here. Actually, the first two provocateurs have made my job a lot easier because they've covered about 2/3 of the points that I was planning to cover. So as Kathy mentioned, I'm Nick Brozovic. I'm Director of Policy at the Daughtry Water for Food Global Institute. Our mission is to improve food and water security globally. To do that, we actually work with many different partners in many different contexts. We go from smallholders to high-tech, high-precision agriculture with some of the most innovative startups. We work with governments and government policies, state-level policy, and also right up to the corporate side on ESG. So Kathy asked me to talk about adaptive management and socio-hydrological systems. So I think I've got about 6.5 minutes on that. I really have 2 points that I'd like to hit on, and they are related, and they actually feed very well into Nora's contributions and Tom's contributions, so I'd like to acknowledge that. The first is that when we think about systems perspectives, and when we think about agricultural water management, it's really important to understand that these are also human systems. And that some of the largest uncertainty that is there in those systems is human behavior, and that human behavior is also adapting, whether it's to policy or technology or market forces. And that's sometimes that is the reason why science-based management can be really, really difficult. And so with that said, there's 2 basic ideas I'd like to discuss. The first is that successful management needs good governance, and good governance is built on trust. And so again, I'm really glad Nora used the word trust just a few minutes ago. Trust is something that we think about a lot when we evaluate why some watersheds, some basins, some schemes tend to be rather functional, and others with similar underlying issues tend to be rather dysfunctional. Trust, unfortunately, takes decades to build. And this is one of the other findings that we find. You don't build trust overnight. You can erode trust overnight, but it takes many years and many decades to build it. And so many of us think about how we build trust and how we use our systems, how we use our scientific frameworks to build trust. That is quite key. We hear this phrase, you can't manage what you don't measure, very often. Actually, probably some of us in this room and online have used it. I'd argue that actually skips an important step. You also can't manage what you don't agree on. And so just measuring a system is necessary but not sufficient. I guess I've betrayed my economic roots there. It's necessary but not sufficient to manage a system. In order to manage a system, the stakeholders, the people involved whose livelihoods depend on that management, have to basically agree on some of the underlying concepts. And so one of the things that we see where science can come in, where technology can come in, is to really support that stakeholder conversation where you bring people that may not think they have a lot in common, and you get them to agree on whether it's the underlying dynamics or even how much water is being used. That's a very powerful process to get to an adaptive management system. Enforcement is necessary, enforcement is hard, enforcement needs trust. And again, it has to be underlain by good data systems. In the same vein, one of the challenges we find is that our ability to think up and implement new technology is now much beyond what it was in the last years and decades. There's a temptation to view technology as a shortcut to trust and to view it as a shortcut to enforcement. I rather view technology as a shortcut to learning. If we treat it rather as a learning tool before a regulatory tool, we'll do well. Now, to my second point, and I'll just take a few more minutes here, we have to understand who's making decisions in a system. And quite often, the stakeholders that are not at the table are the private sector and the decision makers themselves. Partly my comments here are intended to set up the next set of speakers who represent a broad base of the private sector. But I think here it's important to distinguish when we talk about agricultural water management, that often those decision makers look very, very different. When you look at surface water systems, you often have large operators, whether they're public or private, that run canal, reservoir, dam systems with multiple benefits, flood control, energy, drainage, agriculture, and urban water supply. That requires one set of tools and skill sets to manage. When you look at groundwater-dominated systems, such as northern India or the High Plains region of the US, you typically have distributed private systems. In the US case, you have tens of thousands of individual farmers. In the Indian case, you have perhaps tens of millions of individual farmers with privately financed and operated equipment who are each making their own decisions. And it's important to understand how those people interact and how they make decisions, and in particular, the role of agronomists and ag retailers and equipment manufacturers and dealers in determining how those decision makers decide what technology to use, what crops to grow, and how they're going to do it. And I think it's something that many of us don't focus enough on. It's also important to acknowledge when we look at ag retailers and consumer packaged good companies that they are key influencers in the landscape, but they often don't have very clear insights into how their products are being used, whether it's upstream or downstream, what's actually happening on the field. And so it's a challenge for them. And again, I think we're going to hear some great examples of how companies can address those challenges of gaining insights and using their influence to further agricultural water stewardship. So with that, thank you so much, and I'll hand back to Kathy.
So we're going to transition to our response panel, but I'd like to include all of our panelists as part of that discussion and also invite the audience to take part in that discussion. So if you can help with this transition, a little bit on the fly here, I'm going to have our provocateur panelists come up first. And as we're setting you up, just take 2 minutes to see if there's any technical questions from the audience about our provocateur presentations. Oh, I don't see any hands raised. So my provocateurs are off the panel. Let's just have the provocateurs come to this table back here. Thank you. Okay. And let me, if there are no questions, I don't see any hands raised. I'll introduce our response panels who represent the industry and the corporate ag, the companies who are working with the producers on the ground, and I think have a great opportunity to solicit feedback from many folks and to inform the work that we do more broadly, looking across sectors. So first, Moshe Berenstein, who is the director of NetAFIM and of France and president of the European Irrigation Association. Then Madhu Rashesh, Senior Director of Water and Agriculture at the Coca-Cola Company. And Jessica Christensen, Head of Sustainability for the Bayer Crop Science Department. And we'll invite each of them to give their comments to the conversation so far. And then again, invite all of you to share your input and ask questions as we're thinking together about how do we spark a conversation that leads to action once our session is finished. So let's go in the order that I introduced you. Moshe, if you'd like to speak first. Here. Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kathy. And thanks to the panel on the presentation. I'd like to maybe add a few words just for the sake of the context of where I'm coming from. So I work and live in France. I'm dealing mostly with the French market. I'm an irrigation guy for 15 years, and I'm also engaged in the European level as part of the involvement of the Irrigation Association. I'm the MD of Netafim in France. Netafim is the inventor company of the drip irrigation, pioneered what we call today precise irrigation. And I'm here also to share the experience that I'm having as a president of the Irrigation Association, the European Irrigation Association, with you. And I will try to address to the challenge of the four models that I took many notes. I'll try to summarize maybe a few of the takeaways that I got. So actually, what I just wrote to myself here is that most of you mentioned the trust and the decision makers. With Nick, you talked about the decision makers, and now we identify decision makers, which makes it really interesting because we all aim for sustainability, but the way we approach the different decision makers is very different. It's not the same, the arguments that we're raising as a private sector when we talk about your sustainable irrigation with farmers. They're mostly around the sustainability, the profitability of sustainability. It's mostly around the understanding, the basic understanding of the P&L, of the concerns, the ROI of the farmer, because it has to do with the risk-averse approach. It has to do with moving from the traditional way of doing things to an unknown way. So it's mostly about this. It's also, I would say, about promoting or providing knowledge around funds and aids and subsidies to small farmers, because there are many, many small farmers who don't have the access to the time or even the willingness to get and to look for programs. So we're trying to bring this to the farmers, and mostly it's about these aspects. When we talk with water operators, it's completely different. It's about lobbying. It's the political aspect. It's the proof of concept, why we believe that precise irrigation is the right solution on a regional level. And usually what we do here in the collaboration is what I'm doing personally, I'm taking groups of decision makers, political decision makers, to where I came from originally, to Israel, because this is a great example where we can really show good results on practically end-to-end, A to Z water management and irrigation. And these decision makers, they need to see this. And they want to see the examples outside. Like if farmers are buying from farmers usually, the water operators and the legislative part and the decision makers, their decisions are being taken differently. So it's the same route, but it's a different aspect, and the arguments are different. I think that you also mentioned managing uncertainty with Nora and the risk in changing the models. And I would like to add maybe few words regarding this aspect, because I think that there are critical factors and observations about irrigation that are essential for the understanding of the collaboration. If we really want to get to the desired outcome and to meet the SDGs, not only the sixth one, There are so many of them that we can meet using irrigation. One needs to take into account three observations. First of all, is about the paradigm of irrigation. And this is very important because we need to agree that it doesn't make sense to do irrigation the way we used to do it until today. And this is and it's a critical way of thinking because we're not there yet. In some ways, we think that we can continue doing, even in the age of less, as we call it. I don't want to use this, but we have less water, less land, less stability, unpredicted climate. We cannot continue doing the things the way we used to do before. And this understanding is the baseline, I think, for the understanding that irrigation, it's about doing irrigation differently. And it's not about irrigation is not here to serve the industrial part of the agriculture. It's not about maximizing the value. It's about sustaining the value. It's not about growing the quantities. It's about securing the quantities today. It's not about, I think that doing more with water, it's about doing less, using less for doing more. And this is a concept that we need to agree, and we're not there yet. And the second point here, I think, is which is essential, is the inefficiency. We all talk about numbers, and in the last few days, lots of numbers. Just my part of the numbers, few words, 70% of the water, fresh water, goes to irrigation. We all know it by heart. To irrigate 20% of the arable land, 20% that produces around 40 or 50% of the crop production worldwide. But meaning, by the way, that only 80% of the agriculture is like we used to do before. We just wait for the rain, and like worldwide. Look how dependent we are. But even in the 20% that we irrigate like 3/4 of the 75% around is being irrigated with less efficient systems, mostly flood irrigation, which we all can agree that flood irrigation is not the most efficient one, because next to it comes the big guns, like the huge sprinklers or the big sprinklers, which represent another 15%, and then maybe, I don't know, like 5 to 10% is what we call localized irrigation, like what we call precise irrigation, micro irrigation, which is a fraction of the water. So we need to understand that there is a huge gap, technological gap, that we need to overcome, and we need to promote the most sustainable irrigation methods. And the last one is the political, I would say, narrative. It's almost a religious one in a certain way, that there is a preconception, I would say, against irrigation. Because many decision makers and many legislative bodies and all the ecosystem believes that irrigating more, like growing more food, needs more irrigation. More irrigation is about more water and more land. And we're competing on water and land today with our industries, like every liter counts here. But this notion that irrigation it's part of the problem and not the solution, this is something that we need to approach. Every time when we talk about opportunities or we talk about collaboration, we need to take this into account, because this exists. And I give you just maybe a few examples of how we do it today, and then 2 ideas for the future, briefly. So if we're looking on the collaborations that we're having today, I think the most relevant example is what we call Agri 4.0. It's about the digital transformation, the digital revolution in the agriculture. It's not only about irrigation, but this takes the irrigation into the second level of optimization with joint ventures of mature companies and startup companies together that are joining forces on technology. Everything is connected. Even what we used to call, like many years ago, drip irrigation is the sustainable, is the precise irrigation. Yeah, it is, but it's only the basic. How to approach, how to get the water and the nutrition to the plant. But now everything is connected. It's just a vehicle. of water nutrition, but it is connected with sensors and with any other technology, GSM and weather stations, and everything is together. So this is a great example of how we collaborate within. Then we have like so many examples how we collaborate the irrigation, the shaded irrigation together with the agrivoltaic. So it's not only about the SDG 6, it's also about the transformation of energy. There are many debates if it's good or not, or where do you do it and how. But anyway, it's a whole area of shadow of agriculture with agronomical aspects and not hydraulical aspect. The greenhouse gas emission reduction. When we're doing rice, we're talking about rice a little bit today. When we do rice, we do drip irrigation for rice, we promote this aspect of emission of greenhouse gas, and so on. And so I think that you're going to talk about crop protection as well. To finish, two ideas that we would like to have, and would like to propose here. One is around the place of the irrigation. No one is talking about irrigation. I'm talking about the European part. No one is talking. The irrigation doesn't exist in the Green Deal. Doesn't exist in anywhere. Like just search for irrigation in all the thousands and millions of pages. There is no irrigation. And what we're trying to do, what we would like to do as part of the association, is to bring the irrigation into the discussion about sustainability in Europe. Simply saying, to include irrigation in the taxonomy, European taxonomy, aiming to meet the 6 goals of sustainability. The irrigation will be and needs to be defined as an economical activity. Once we talk about economical activity, within the taxonomy of Europe, we start talking about how to do it in a sustainable way. And this will bring the investment, and this will bring everyone, private and also governments, to invest more in proceeding and in advancing. The second part, the last one, is just about labeling. In 2 words, labeling, we need to put label, and we need to call the irrigation to define the sustainable irrigation as a practice that we promote. And this one is very relevant, mostly for the food chain companies. We call the food chain companies to join us and to define, to change, to help the farmers to move to practices which are more sustainable, and to define and to help to promote the awareness on irrigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Moshe. So I appreciate your call for a more balanced idea of irrigation. It also gives me a chance to say, and remember drainage. We need to manage drainage as well.
Yeah.
We don't talk about that side of water management. Before I pass the ball, I feel like we're polarized here on 2 sides. Yeah. So if I could invite our panelists to all come around up to the table with us, and I'll switch places with you. You can maybe Shama and Madhu, you can come to the middle. Or?
To be here?
Yeah.
Now the balls are just closer together.
Yeah. Mix up.
Hi everyone, I'm Madhu Rajesh. I'm from Coca-Cola, and I lead Coca-Cola's work on water and sustainable agriculture. Challenge after 5-6 great speakers is that they've said almost everything that there is to be said. So I'll try and see what new information I can bring to the table. But for us at Coca-Cola, water is our first ingredient, and we look at a lot of sustainability issues from the lens of water. But also a lot of water is, we recognize the majority of the water footprint lies in agricultural supply chains. And so there's a huge body of work that we try and do with our ingredient suppliers and in agricultural context as well. The Coca-Cola Foundation, the company, and our franchise bottling system have a long history of investing in agriculture-based projects for this reason, and we've integrated water management practices in our new 2030 water security strategy, which looks at working with our suppliers to promote advanced water management practices, as well as integrating agriculture as part of our watershed stewardship goals as well. What we've learned from the many projects that the Coca-Cola Foundation and our bottlers and the company have supported is that there are interconnectivities between water and soil health and greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 sequestration, and other climate goals, as well as looking at some of the societal and social benefits of projects, looking at farmer income, cost, profitability of farming overall. And what I feel is that very often those interconnectivities are not recognized as much as they should be, but perhaps taking a more holistic rather than a siloed approach to agricultural production would generate impact at a greater scale. And I'll give you some examples from our work. In Egypt, for example, the Coca-Cola Foundation worked with a UNDP and Global Water Challenge to support a project with farmers that were growing tomatoes, and they used agricultural residue and crop compost as biofertilizers, and through that we realized that that helped improve the soil's holding capacity for water, which then improved the amount of water that was needed for irrigation or the water absorbed from rainfall, and therefore led to agricultural water efficiency improvements. So, and it had improvements in soil health quality and other benefits as well. And those interconnectivities have formed the basis of the work that we're doing now and want to take learnings on to build for future. And I'm sure we'll hear more from other panelists. But I think in terms of barriers to this work, a few things that I'd like to highlight is for change to happen at scale. First of all, I think companies like ours that don't buy directly from farmers, just closer engagement with suppliers and understanding sourcing regions and having better visibility of where the products are sourced from definitely will help action collaboratively with suppliers. But then also what we've learned is agricultural contexts are very, very different. And so it depends on whether the commodities are annuals or perennials, whether they're rain-fed or whether they're irrigated crops. And even that is changing because it may be a rain-fed crop, drought happens, and there's no irrigation infrastructure. How do you cope with that? So understanding really that local context of the crop and rainfall and weather patterns in a geography is really important in designing projects that would be helpful. The role of different actors in the ecosystem, so the role that governments and other stakeholders play in making sure there is infrastructure in the value chain is very important. And then the other thing I'd say, and I'd stop there, is I come from a small country, sorry, not a small country, a very large country with a lot of smallholder farmers, and come from a family of sugarcane producers where, you know, farmers own less than half an acre of land. And it's very much about survival on a day-to-day basis, and going to those farmers and talking about more sustainable approaches doesn't get the conversation very far unless you're able to demonstrate what that's going to do for their daily income and increase the livelihoods of their families. And that context is very different from, let's say, corn farmers in the US, very large farms, even though the definition of smallholder farmers is, I've learned, is different in different countries, but, you know, comparatively very large farms using the highest end technology, and the context there is very, very different. And so really breaking it down, what it means in each geography and designing solutions, but also thinking through where there are parallels and opportunities to learn is critical. And I'll pause there. Probably spoke too much.
No, not at all. But that's great. And I was so thrilled to have Coca-Cola a part of the panel because you've been leaders in thinking about bringing hydrogeology, you know, as part of our framework to thinking about where these practices can make the biggest difference. And I think that's not yet reflected so well in our systems model, and maybe an opportunity for us to strengthen the work that we do together. Okay. Jessica, you have the ball last. And again, Jessica comes from Bayer Crop Science, and Bayer has been a wonderful FAR partner. They've been working with us to try and tackle the linkages between soil water content and soil health processes, and it's that knowledge that will enable us to optimize water management. So thrilled to have you a part of the panel.
Thank you, and thanks for having me, and hope everybody's hanging in there. I know it's getting late in the day, but it's good to be last in some regards. So let me talk a little bit about what we do, and then I'm going to try to connect the dots too, because I took a lot of notes as well. So I'm Jess Christensen. I lead sustainability and business stewardship for the Global Crop Science Division. We're on millions of hectares around the world, so we have a lot of scale. So when we talked about scale earlier, in various segments. So from big row crops, staple crops, to vegetables, fruit and vegetables, from our crop protection products to biologics, and we have a digital farming arm as well. So we touch a lot of different areas of the entire system. So we as a company have our own sustainability goals, as we should, like all big industry players and small industry players. So our goals, and what I liked about what Kathy started off with, is the interconnectedness of these goals. There's not one or the other. You do have trade-offs to make sometimes, but for example, we have goals around greenhouse gas in our own operations and as a company around climate neutrality and net zero targets, of course, but we wanted to go even farther and say, how can we help reduce our farmers' footprint on the field of greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030? We have a smallholder farmer improvement goal. So basically, how do you empower and improve the livelihoods of 100 million smallholder farmers? So big scale. That's another commitment we've made and that we're tracking. We have an environmental impact reduction goal. So that's really about crop protection. So if you think about what's applied, how it's applied in the system, in the cropping system, it's really important that we keep innovating there. And so we have a 30% reduction goal of environmental impact of our crop protection portfolio by 2030. And our newest commitment is around water, which we rolled out at the UN Water Conference in March, which is really building on what we're already doing in our own operations. Again, we have a lot of manufacturing facilities and sites around the world. So the value of water is one area we're working on. How do we actually put a value on that, integrate that into our business strategies and our own operations? But importantly, in the downstream piece, again, with our farmer customers is, you know, we as one of the big players, have a responsibility and I think have a great opportunity to work on more resilient cropping systems. And so it's particularly in water scarce regions. And so we're going to start with rice, thus the comments around rice. I know it's been talked about a lot this week already, but rice uses about a third of the irrigation water just for rice production. It releases about 10 to 12% of methane globally every year, right? So it's huge. Plus, it's a big food security crop. So over 150 million smallholder farmers rely on rice. So we wanted to tackle systems that actually touch upon all the interconnectedness of these sustainable focal areas. So as you think about that, you got to have I think about these areas, these sustainability areas, as the what and the why. And then to our farmer customers, it's how do we really evolve to more regenerative practices, regenerative systems? And that's a journey. And it's not about the definition. I know you could debate about the terms and the definitions. It's not about that. It's really about the outcomes that we're trying to drive. Grower profitability and productivity has to be cornerstone to that to get adoption, right? So we talked about what are some of the hurdles. You can't ignore profitability, especially subsistence farmers, you know, that are day-to-day trying to live versus big corn growers in the Midwest of the U.S. We can have similar goals, but you need to be flexible in how we get there. So in that piece, you know, our rice strategy, so the water commitment on rice is to reduce the water use by 25% per kg of rice crop produced. We're focusing first in India as the big contributor to rice production. And it's really, how do you go from a flood irrigated paddy rice production system to a direct seeded rice production system? And so that takes lots of collaboration across public-private sectors. We don't have all the answers as Bayer, right? And so we have a lot to offer, but we need a lot of work to actually make that happen. A barrier to that too is how do you reach millions of smallholder farmers just in India, let alone globally? So you have to have the right digital tools, you have to have the right data capture mechanisms, make sure we're being very transparent in how we're calculating things. We have to have a lot of capacity building and training. So how do we help them learn and grow? That's going to be one big focus. We're focusing on these systems where regionally it makes sense. So we're working on corn and in the western U.S., for example, and some other crops, almonds, and our vegetable businesses too in a lot of these areas. So we're going crop system approach to try to get to that value. I want to make a comment on I think, Nora, you talked about sort of managing uncertainty versus reducing. I think that's a really good comment because there is uncertainty. Our farmer customers, by the way, live in that world every day. There's so much they don't control. So I do think it's about how do we share that risk in a different way. So we talked about the switch from paddy flooded rice production to direct seeded. This is a very cultural thing too. For hundreds of years, rice production has been done this way. So how do you help them mitigate and maybe have certain incentives for a bridging period so they can actually transition to hopefully more productive systems with more sustainable practices to be more self-sufficient, right? And then I think there's not a good or bad. I think that was another comment Nora said, and I think this is how going to the trust discussion. When you're talking to farmers, they don't like to be, they are competitive, by the way. I don't care if I'm talking to a farmer in India or a farmer in Brazil. They like to compete. So we have to be thoughtful about how we position this too for people to understand it, to really own it, to feel connected to it. So it's not good or bad. It's what are we doing today? We've made tons of improvement already in food production, but where else can we go? So it's good and better in my mind. So how do we bring people with a different tone to the table? And that's the last comment I'll make is around that stakeholder piece. So I think, again, collaboration is absolutely critical. There's no way any one of us can do it. So working with food chain partners on market access and what their goals are, to working with the policymakers, it has to all work in sync. So to me, I like the concept of test and learn. So you're going to have to try. We're going to have to try. We will fail some. But I think we need to create that safe place to do that, or else we'll be paralyzed and not move fast enough, quite frankly. So thank you. It was a pleasure going last, actually, too. That was kind of cool. So really appreciate it, you guys.
So we have about 20 minutes left, and the idea is to try and facilitate this as a discussion and hopefully have some responses amongst the panelists, but also we're going to try and monitor the chat, and if folks in the audience want to raise their hand and contribute, we welcome that. And I'll start with Jessica. You mentioned this initiative in India and asking about, we started today's discussion with an emphasis on learning while doing, right? That there's a lot of uncertainty. So in thinking about the opportunity for public-private partnerships, can you say a bit, are you thinking about working with universities, and are you thinking about also working with stakeholders, the producers, to learn as you're experimenting?
Yeah, absolutely. So we already have pilots ongoing in India in the DSR system, direct seeded rice system. So we work with everybody from, IRRI, big institutions, to more local academics, to food chain companies that are local too. They're sourcing the rice. And at the center of all of that are our growers. NetFM's part of some of these discussions when it comes to irrigation technology. So we're really thinking about everything up front. So it's how do you, from cash liquidity and financing through to the services and inputs and how you do it, to the off-takers. So we already have pilots ongoing, and we have what's called a direct acres program that basically is incentivizing the switch. So we're testing it now. So we're going to see how it goes. The other partnership we have around India rice is we announced a partnership with Gen Zero and the Shell India Energy Company to talk about what we can do to basically incentivize farmers to change practices, and then see where that goes from a carbon and co-benefit opportunity. So we're trying to tackle it various ways all at once, and I think that's what you need to do for scale.
Excellent. If there are any questions in the audience, please raise your hand, and we have a microphone to go around. Oh, wonderful. Do we have our help with the microphones? Do we have is there a cue that we can give to pass the microphone?
I like the initiative. He just went and got the mic. That was perfect. Thank you.
Well, since the microphone's closest to me, sorry for jumping the queue, but another microphone is coming down. Now, if you'd just like to raise your hand again for the question, the microphone will come to you. Thank you. And apologies while that microphone makes its way to you. My name is Richard Colback. I'm here with IFC, Investment Finance Corporation. We are partnered with Bayer and with NetFM. I just want to make a shout out to the work that we're doing with Better Farm Life Alliance in India, where we've had some success. I think there's been some interest in scaling that up, and it brings together insurance, it brings together inputs, it brings together irrigation, thanks to NetFM, and Bayer has taken a huge role in that. Very innovative in your models, and I'm glad to see that you've got a range of these initiatives. I'd love to learn more about the initiatives we're not involved in, because I think we can learn a lot from those. We don't need to do everything, we can't do everything, but Bayer seems to be wanting to do everything, so congratulations.
Thank you. No, and we'll follow up, Richard, for sure. So the Better Life Farming that gets to the local piece too, because these are run by local community members. It's not run by our company either. So it's really about how do you prop up the economics of the villages as well. But thanks for all the support with those, because yeah, IFC has been instrumental. Yeah.
Okay, I got a mic. You can hear me? Very good. I'm going to be brave here. I'm Remco Dolsen from the Antea Group, the Netherlands. And I'm actually come from a very small country, the Netherlands, which is very efficient in agriculture. We do a lot of food production, but as a result, now we see a dramatic drop in climate diversity. Yeah. So if we make systems more efficient, agriculture more or irrigation more efficient, less water, what's that going to do with our biodiversity? So how are you going to tackle having a biodiverse agriculture where you also take indeed chemicals and water and all that in consideration so that we don't fuel the next crisis?
Do you want me to start? I feel like I'm dominating, so somebody else want to start that one, and then I can certainly chime in.
Well, on behalf of the Nature Conservancy, I appreciate that
Yeah.
question. Thank you.
So I was looking over at you. I'm like, they're
Yeah,
good to kick it off.
Right, with water efficiency specifically, we've had a lot of concerns, and I alluded to that in my remarks, but that in some of these water scarce areas, if we just keep promoting more water efficient practices, are we enabling increased consumption of water and further depleting the ecosystems? And so that is a big concern of ours. It goes a lot to what are the practices and how are you measuring it, and ensuring that you're looking not just at a farm scale efficiency, but what are the basin scale impacts, which is something I tried to talk about. I think there's, though, a bigger question in there that you were asking about kind of the diversity of these production systems. How do you integrate more diverse cropping patterns and starting to incorporate natural systems and agroforestry and other practices that can bring in more diversity into agriculture. And I side more with the water people. But I do have a lot of my colleagues on the regenerative food system side who are looking at that question, and that is definitely something that we're trying to promote. And I'd be interested to hear from the other panelists who are more in the agriculture space how they think about that.
I think one thing which I can add is that a lot of practices that we also see that help promote the use of organic fertilizers or help reduce the use of pesticides in farming, then improve the quality or the organic matter, and that has a positive impact. So I think it's about really looking at the practice and making sure the programs are designed in a holistic way to not cause unintended negative consequences, and that as long as that's done right, then we're looking at positive benefits. But
Yeah.
not sure if you want to add.
And I can chime in real quick too. So thank you for the question, and it's hard. It's just hard. Biodiversity is a big topic. We focus on that too, obviously, because it interweaves with everything we just talked about. So I would say, first of all, having diverse cropping systems is really critical. And so we for many years have been talking about crop rotations, and you do have to adjust and be flexible depending on what you're growing and where you're growing it. But crop rotation is a big part of this. There's diversity within a crop too. So we spend a lot of time in our breeding organization, for example, to make sure we have good diverse germplasm even within each crop to be more resilient in the environment, right? So I think it's two things. There's crop diversity, and then there's diversity within the genetic base for the crops. So you have to have diversity, though, if you're truly going to get to regenerative systems, quite honestly, right? I think that's a core part, is how do you kind of, how to pull all that together. And then, you know, the quality pieces and the ecosystem, the water ecosystems, these guys did a great job. So our environmental impact reduction goal, that's part of it. So it's not about just volumes of crop protection that's applied. It's really about what you're applying and how as well. So we have a model, happy to discuss that with anybody later, that has generated initially with some academics. And it's really taking several different approaches to assess this risk, the impact risk. And then we are using that model in our innovation decisions. So how do our products actually fit in with our goals? So we're putting sustainability data and metrics even in our pipeline at a product level. Then pre-commercial, thinking about how does that fit into a system with our grower at the center of that, to try to get to more proactive protection on species and nature and the whole biodiversity topic. Soil health is underpinning that too a lot, of course, as we've said. But good questions. Any thoughts, please? Well, we welcome those.
If I can add a comment on this one as irrigation, because I think that this topic is very relevant to the way you use irrigation, the place of irrigation in the ecosystem and the biodiversity. There is, of course, the rotational part of that is being promoted by irrigation, but irrigation is not always the solution. It's not like immediately we're looking for every place to be irrigated. It's just one part of the resilient agriculture that we're aiming to promote, that is a complementary one. Many times before irrigation, we need to consider many other aspects of soil health. We need to, different varieties, or different, like the adaptation of the agriculture to the changes in the climate and so on. And then the irrigation is coming as a complementary solution. So it's not only about the irrigation, because of course there are pros and cons for everything. Also for the irrigation, for the precise irrigation as well.
I'm going to jump in with a couple of comments again. I guess you framed a great question.
Yeah.
So, I mean, first of all, in terms of the chemical application, I'm actually really optimistic about some of the agricultural technology that's coming up now around precision chemical application, around some of the machine learning for pest control, some of the biologicals. And so that's a place where it's not really water related, but there's a place where some of the new technologies I think will change our relationship with how we apply chemicals on the land in a very positive way. On the irrigation side, actually fertigation is something that irrigation allows you to do that you can't do when you don't irrigate. And so there are some cases that I'm aware of in the US where people are irrigating solely for the fertigation benefits because it reduces the nitrate leaching into the soils. So it's important to understand that there is a role there as well. And then I have to make one other comment. People talk about efficiency a lot. People talk about water saving a lot. This is one of these perhaps third rails that we talk about a lot, that we have to be really careful when we say water saving. Mm-hmm. That there is essentially a linear relationship between water consumption and crop yield. And so if you hear somebody say, we saved water and our crop yields went up, what they really mean is more of the water that we put on the land went to the crop. And so we have to be, again, generally there's not an issue there. The issue comes, and I speak as an economist, when you move to a quantification and commodification of water savings. So, and again, if we look at a Western water context, most of Western water, the law is written on consumed water, which is the correct thing really to manage, but we often measure and manage applied water. And so a lot of the misunderstandings that as a stakeholder community we have come down to this, and it's a lot trickier than many other chemicals. Carbon, for example, in many ways carbon accounting is much easier than water accounting. I'd get in trouble for saying that, I'm sure, but it's my opinion. So it's a thing to be really, really careful of. What we mean when we say water saving actually varies between us. So thank you. Great question.
So I'm going to add, but also remind us that you can't do carbon accounting without water accounting. Mm-hmm. But also to say your question really brings up an important knowledge gap, right? The trade-offs and how do we optimize those outcomes. And this is a problem with the systems model. If we use a crop model or a watershed model, it's not enabling us to do those, assess those trade-offs. And so this is where, as a research funder, I'm really excited to kind of stir some excitement and let's get some investment in this area.
Somebody up there.
Thank you all. This kind of builds on the last two comments, but I was wondering your thoughts on water trading markets and if they actually encourage, smarter water use between areas that they're trading, or if it kind of just continues to encourage status quo irrigation and farming.
It's a great question. So I work a lot on water trading and water markets and value of water. So again, first of all, what water markets mean is really different between people. There are very large informal water markets in much of the global south and actually also in the western US. I don't think you're referring to those. I think you're referring to the water markets that fall within a regulatory infrastructure where you're allowed to reallocate water. It's third-party transfers for money. Every water trading system is only as good as the regulations underlying it, and it's only as good as your enforcement system. So the first observation is, if you incentivize people to generate a new revenue stream from water, they're going to cheat, and you're going to catch them. And so if you want to do water trading, you need to be ready to deal with that as it happens. From an economic point of view, water reallocation in general, whether it's done through a trading mechanism or not, is a very efficient way of increasing the value of water. So we talk about generating the most dollars per drop of water, the most value to society. One of the features of many water rights systems is that the way that water is allocated is in some cases 500 or 1,000 years old. So the example I love to give is the oldest water rights system that is still functional is in Oman. It's over 1,000 years old, and it's worked for over 1,000 years. But I think probably the first water trading system occurred shortly after the first canal was built. Right, so it's a human condition that we like to reallocate, we like to trade. It can work. Water trading can get you into very bad situations if you don't take into account environmental water needs, if you don't take into account social justice needs. Those, in a sense, fall outside of the trading framework, but that's why you need the regulatory side to support it. Tom is an expert on.
I'll just add one thing from our perspective too, because we as an ag player, as an ag company, look at markets all the time, right? So we have different business models we're testing as we're learning and trying. I think the complexity with water markets too is how does this work with additionality? So we already have gold standard carbon credit values, which really take in co-benefits like water or soil health or the social aspect. So I think it's going to be tricky as we figure out how does all that play, and double counting, for example, if you have partnerships and joint ventures in some of these spaces, how do you share that amongst all the players? And importantly, the grower. So, we have to make sure the grower's receiving that benefit or some of the benefit as well, which can be tricky. And then you throw in the biodiversity discussion. So I know there's already comments around what about nature-based credits, right? So I think the whole credit scheme is going to be very interesting from a policy and a regulatory perspective, because I think each country is looking at them very differently too, to Nick's point. So it's a good question. I don't know that we have the answer. I think from our perspective, we're focused more on the outcome of increasing productivity. So, we always have said produce more with less. That's kind of our sustainable mission. Now it's produce more and restore more. So we're evolving to that production system. What comes around that could be great opportunity, right? But I think that first you got to get the systems right, the technology right, the practices right to even enable anything else to happen. But good question. If you find out more, let me know. We're all interested.
Yeah, so we're coming up on the close, and I'd like to invite our panelists. Oh, we'll take one more question, yep. And then while we're moving the microphone, I'll warn our panelists, I'll give you all 30 seconds if you'd like closing remarks. Otherwise, I can take up all the space, so.
Hello? Does it? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much for accepting the last question. Just for the a bit overall question for the global water sustainability goal, what kind of considerations or role do you give to rangelands as absolutely important things of carbon sequestration and for regulating the water, the hydrology cycle? Thank you very much. My name is Lauren Burcha from UNESCO. Thank you.
Well, I mentioned that TNC works in water and food systems, and often we don't always talk. We actually also work in kind of agriculture, food production, and rangelands, and those are also separate programs in a way. So I think it's raising that point again about integration and thinking across not just food and water like directly, but also some of the wider systems that are implicated, including lands and rangelands. We do have a program. I've been working with them who've been looking at some of the rangelands opportunities and impacts, but it just, to me, it speaks to the need to continue. I mean, it's a challenge, I think, when you try to do systems thinking, where do you draw the line, essentially, or how do you integrate these new circles? We hope to get at that issue in the Nature Conservancy, but we haven't solved it.
This is where I really appreciate the partnership with Bear, right? So really digging at the mechanisms underlying, the connection between soil water content and these ecosystem services so that we can apply that knowledge to any system under changing climate conditions.
Yep. And I think rangelands is an important part of it. So a lot of our growers are actually, they're ranchers too. So they do both. So when we think about land use, and it's a big, big driver for a lot of the sustainability impacts, it's how do we find the best use of the land? That might be leaving it fallow, it might be production, right? So we look at that globally. We have a lot of work in Brazil and Latin America around forest protection, and as well as there's lots of rangeland there too, right? So we're constantly in this balance. But again, that's not easy because you don't want to pit the sides against each other. So it's how do you bring folks together. Sometimes they're the same player, sometimes they're not. But I think it's a great call out that I think between all of us, we need to make sure we're connecting those dots because it is part of the system.
So last chance, otherwise I'll step up and just thank everyone. First, I want to thank Nora. I'm going to echo, I think you were the leader in helping us to be comfortable with talking about uncertainty. Right, and trust means being able to put those unknowns, those risks on the table. And I also appreciate the panelists for having that discussion. I think giving an example of the kind of discussion that's needed to move these partnerships forward. And already I'm excited about conversations on the backside of 5:30. And thanks to everyone for a great session.